Heraclitus said, "Pantit rea," all flows. And I think that this is the hardest thing to learn. It certainly has been the hardest thing for me to learn in my life. And I assume then, by extrapolation, maybe this is one of the hard things to come to terms with. Everything flows. Nothing lasts. I mean, not the travail, not the horror, not the women you love, not the women who drive you crazy, not the children you love, not the children that drive you crazy. Everything is in the process of changing into something else, even at the very moment that you recognize its coherence as an entity. And this is the bad news that the ego doesn't want to hear. This is what the ego is created to deny, because the ego is, it's all tied up with our fear of death. We assume that if we release ourselves into this flow, we will be swept away, that our identity will cease to exist, that we will somehow not be there. This is an artifact of language. It's a horrible misunderstanding about who we are and how the whole system is working.
Are you using language as a meta word more than just the syntactic, syllables that we're using?
Well, no, that's all I mean. But I'm really aware of what a funny thing it is. You talk about other dimensions. Language is like an informational creature of some sort. I mean, languages live, they reproduce themselves.
Virus.
Yes, it's a kind of virus. William Burroughs said this.
Yeah.
He said English is a virus from outer space. I have no quarrel with this. This seems entirely reasonable. It's a very strange thing. Reality is made out of language. And for most of the people in this room, it's made out of English. And yet we spend a great deal of time worrying about quarks and mu mesons and electromagnetic radiation. And all this is entirely a fiction. None of this stuff exists. All that exists are words. And we play a game, a really fairly insidious game with ourselves. We all, I suppose, here give great credence to what is called quantum physics. Is there anyone here who would care to explain to the group several of the core doctrines of quantum physics? Or any core doctrine? And by explain, I don't mean a verbal gloss. I mean give us the hardcore equations. Well, no one seems to be coming forth. And yet, this is our truth. How crazy are you if your truth is something you can't even understand? And that's the situation that we're in. We believe that somewhere among us, somebody understands these tensor equations of the third degree, and that if it got real tight, we could go to them and they would then explain what reality is. Well, this is a head full of shit, this kind of thinking. What you are actually dealing with is what Wittgenstein called the present at hand. The present at hand. Good phrase, because it implies that only that which can be grasped matters. And the quark cannot be grasped, the mu meson, the electromagnetic field, none of this. These things need to be understood for what they are, which is little shingles which we epoxy onto the face of the universal mystery. And once you have a bunch of these little shingles epoxied onto the face of the mystery, then you can't see the mystery at all anymore, and you call that an explanation. Say, well, that's taken care of. We've explained it. By the time a child is 8 or 9 or 5 or 6, they have covered the entirety of reality with these interlocking little linguistic tiles. And nowhere now is reality to be found. Between ourselves and reality, as quickly as we possibly can, we erect a lie. We erect a false set of assumptions that our culture bound. And this has always impressed me, the culture-bound nature of language, that in a way you can never leave the place you're raised in because you acquire a local language. And the local language is all you ever really have. I had an experience of this that brought it home to me very strongly, because when I first went to the tropics, I was there as a professional butterfly collector, and it was pretty important to make a living. And my impression of the jungle was that it was green. That was my impression. Well, then 3 years later, I went back with botanists. Well, if you know anything about botany and taxonomy, what it is it's an orgy of language. I mean, leaves are lanceolate, crenellate. They have bracts, which are sessile, umbellate, and indentified, and so forth. And so these are specialized words to describe structure. You go with a botanist into the jungle, and the jungle becomes unbelievably rich. Here are melanostomes, malfigs, varrolas, all kinds of things. And as soon as you put words to it, reality emerges. So you see, here is language as a double-edged sword. Out of the undifferentiated, it creates miraculous new realities to which we immediately habituate, undervalue, and profane. In other words, familiarity breeds contempt. But somewhere between silence and the familiarity that breeds contempt is the living essence of the word and its meaning. This problem of language is central, I think, to understanding the psychedelic experience. What I see happening on these tryptamines is the project of language goes from being something which you hear to something which you see without ever crossing over a quantized moment of transition. Well, this is, to my mind, absolutely astonishing, and I think I'm a pretty tough nut to crack. When you see language, it's amazing, because it's a paranormal thing, or it's like it cheats. It achieves paranormal intensity without violating any of the laws of physics that I'm familiar with. What I'm talking about is that in these shamanic performances in the Amazon and on psilocybin, language goes from something beheld to something seen. There's precedent for this. In the Hellenistic world of Greco-Romanism, the be-all and the end-all of spiritual accomplishment was what's called the logos. And the logos was an informing voice, a voice in the head that told you the right way to live. And Plato and all of these heavies cultivated and achieved connection with the logos. Well, there was a Alexandrine Jew named Philo-Judaeus, who was a great commentator on the religions of his period, and he wrote about what he called the more perfect logos. The more perfect logos. And he said, what is the more perfect logos? And then he answered his own question. The more perfect logos goes from being heard to being seen without ever crossing over a quantized moment of transition. Language is something unfinished in us. It's something that was catalyzed out of animal organization by hallucinogenic activation of brain states, and it is something that is in the act of perfecting itself. And when it is completed, my faith is that words will be seen, not heard. The whole way in which we organize our language around visual metaphors when we talk about clarity. So if someone is able to communicate, we say She spoke clearly. That's a visual metaphor. We say, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. That means I understand you. I see what you mean. He painted a picture. It means unconsciously, at the unconscious level, we connect visual metaphors and the visual sense with clarity of understanding. And what's happening in the ayahuasca cults, in the mushroom intoxications and so forth, is an invocation of the visible logos. It comes into being in the shared space. You control it with sound. I mean, you discover that sound is something that you can see. And this is, I referred to this morning and when I talked about how we may be a one gene mutation away from a transformation of language. You can sit, feel perfectly normal, not feel wired or depressed, not have visual activity in the visual field, and then you generate a tone like and you see that it's a certain shade of lemon yellow with a chartreuse edge running on it. And then you and it shifts to pink blue. Well, you begin to experiment with this and you discover very quickly that you can do more than just generate colors. You can generate modalities. You can generate shapes as you begin to relax into an unconscious expression of syntax. Form begins to behave itself in the space in front of you. And that language may have existed a very long time before anybody got the idea that you could use a certain sound, like glass, to mean a certain complex object. Because on psilocybin, glossolalia is frequently triggered. Glossolalia is normally presented as speaking in tongues, a religious phenomenon of fundamentalism, and the fundamentalist spin on it is that these are ancient biblical languages and that you're being possessed by an angel or something. But in fact, at the primitive level of religion worldwide, glossolalia is frequently met with. And all of us have an ability to relax away from meaning and still retain syntax. It's just something you would never do because we're programmed to always mean something when we speak. But in fact, babies don't do this at all. They love to babble, and they only late in the process learn to attach meaning. Well, so then under language in the humble service of meaning, there is language for itself, sort of the ding en siche of language. And, well, I'll give an example of it and then discuss what's going on. Nidige vond wai haksikivichni molgom voapaketen didikini hipikektet dejigeve wai ham bikikitit if mo oktive indidikt quahabagenket kifidut ulmikin dital. Okay, now what's happening here? First of all, ordinarily we associate this speed of vocal noise with words. Words are small mouth noises. That's all they are. You see, if you're going to have a creature which communicates among the members of its species, you have to have a low energy form of communication. Otherwise, you'd be exhausted from the effort to communicate. Well, small mouth noises are great. A person can talk for about 12 hours without stopping fairly effortlessly. I mean, if you've got water and a little dope rolled, and it's not a problem. Well, do you know how much information a person could convey in 12 hours if they were, say, reading the telephone book aloud? It's pretty amazing. So this thing I just did, it had syntax, but it had no meaning. In other words, if you listen to it, you hear that sounds repeat, rhythms repeat, there appear to be prefixes, suffixes, certain kinds of declensions. It's all there, folks. It just doesn't mean anything. But it turns out that the activity of language feels like language, whether it means anything or not. Well, in the psychedelic state, you discover this same set of tinker toys that was used to create the little speech I just did can be used to create sculptures that are free form, that this hi huai waxi q vini mau hakti kipipit, it looks a certain way. What's important is not how it sounds. What's important is how it looks. In the Amazon, in these ayahuasca cults, they have what they call icaros, magical songs. Icaros are visual art. They are intended that way, and they're criticized that way, and their success or failure is judged entirely in the visual domain, and yet they are made out of sound. And what they convey are very complex feelings. You could almost say three-dimensional feelings. Feelings so complex that they won't lay down and be a sound like hate, fear, revulsion. They won't do that. They can only be laid out as grammatical objects of a higher order. And I think that this process is happening in human beings, the push toward visible language. But it's being accelerated by the psychedelics, and that we are trying to become for each other visual objects, and we are trying to become capable of generating these things. Now, why I hold these conclusions is because in the DMT flash, which is the most intense quintessence, most quintessential distillation of this kind of stuff, you encounter the shamanic entities, the spirits, the ancestors. And this is really confounding. I mean, we can put up with shifting cobwebs of color and weird insights about our nostrils and our little fingers, but not entities. And yet, in that space, these things exist. And they're preaching this ontological transformation of language. This is how entities in hyperspace communicate. It's as though everything has had one dimension added onto it. It's as though we are existing in some kind of squashed version of a larger superspace that can simply be mentally unfolded through the act of encountering a psychedelic substance. I think it's big news that these entities exist. Now, if you were to go to a shaman in a classical culture and say, what's it about? What's going on here? They would unhesitatingly tell you that these are the ancestors. Say, oh yes, these are the ancestors. We cure using the ancestors. And this is, I think, very unsettling for us as Westerners. We'd much rather accept the notion of friendly extraterrestrials communicating through the mushroom than that this is the dearly departed. I mean, that really, you can feel your boundaries beginning to quake against that possibility.